Hello and a very warm welcome to our audience around the world. This is Düz Danışaq, an Azerbaijani channel broadcasting from Washington, D.C. We're coming to you live. I am Ismail Jalilov, your host for today, and we're going to discuss the war in Ukraine as has been our habit for the last, I want to say, 2, 3 months since the war started. At the very beginning, we counted the days and hours of the war. We thought that this madness would be over very soon. And now it seems the mood has shifted, and we collectively have resigned to the war lasting an indefinite period of time. Ladies and gentlemen, usually they say, and I'm paraphrasing what I've heard many years ago, that the first victim of the war is the truth. In my view, the first victim of the war is human rights, the rights that we all have come to cherish and take for granted here in the West or around the world. And these are the very rights that fall victim to an invasion that we are seeing unfold in Europe. I'm especially bothered by the fact that one of the parties of this war is the Russian Federation, the nation that has been so openly scornful of the very notion of human rights and freedoms and liberties from the get-go. And its conduct during the war, if we were to believe and trust the media organizations covering the war, is quite worrisome and troublesome. And we wanted to discuss the situation there with our guest, Rachel Denber. She is a Deputy Director for Europe and Central Asia at Human Rights Watch. Rachel, hi, how are you? Nice to see you.
Glad to be with you, Ismail.
Rachel, I'm sorry I'm a little at a loss. I'm choosing words carefully. It's a very emotional situation for me watching this war unfold from the very beginning. I was working with a Ukrainian TV channel covering the war from the very first hours of it, and then the situation in Kiev made it no longer possible, no longer tenable, broadcasting. My question to you is, when the dust settles, do you think this war will be different from many other wars we have seen in terms of the violations of human rights? I mean, I want to look at the war through the prism of your organization and your personal knowledge, because I know you know the region personally. You've traveled there extensively. You speak the language, and you understand what's going on maybe much better than many, many others that I've spoken to here in the West. What do you think is different? Is there anything that sets this war apart from others?
Well, Ismail, that's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it and not answer it. So I'm going to answer it, but not from the perspective of human rights. I'm going to answer it from just the factual look at the types of armed conflicts that we've seen in the past few decades. For the most part, they have been internal armed conflicts or wars of an international character. I think we see very few armed conflicts, very few wars, particularly in Europe, but also around the world, that involve the outright invasion with a massive invasion force of one country into another country's territory. Those wars have been rarer in the past few decades. So that doesn't say anything about human rights. But you asked what's different from what make this war different from wars that have taken place recently, or wars where there have been humanitarian law violations that we've documented. Very few of those wars are wars in which there is a massive invasion force, not just airstrikes, but like a massive invasion force with the purpose of claiming territory. So the U.S. obviously had a massive invasion force when it invaded Afghanistan, or U.S. and allied forces. The U.S. had a massive invasion force when it invaded Iraq. The purpose, as far as I think it's pretty clear, the purpose of those wars wasn't to seize or establish, wasn't to seize territory. But I don't know that. I mean, that might make that makes a difference to historians. Obviously, that makes a lot of difference to people, to Ukrainians. But this is a war of I think that sets this war apart from many others.
Well, thank you for bringing it up. Actually, the war to claim massive swaths of territory. It also means subjugating large groups of population.
Exactly.
So when we're dealing with an invasion, we are dealing with the direct contact between invading forces on the one side and civilians on the other, civilians that hadn't had the chance to escape. As we see in parts of Ukraine, were not allowed humanitarian routes. And that is exactly why I asked this question. From the point of view of the humanitarian law, do you think this war will stand out in memory as one of the most egregious examples of violating human rights, especially since we're dealing with Russia? I don't want to prejudge, but Russia has been scornful about human rights, the very notion and idea of human rights. Do you think that Russia is adhering to certain rules of conduct of military operations that we've come to expect over the years? Or do you think this will be different? I know it's a little early to ask this question, but I'm pretty sure you're looking at it closely.
Well, those are three questions kind of rolled in one.
As usual, my signature, I apologize.
Quite all right. I have to leave the first question to the historians, just how this war will compare to others in terms of the level of violations and civilian suffering. I have to leave that to the historians and onto the comparative historians. I've often been asked by journalists how this war compares to other armed conflicts that have happened in this region or other armed conflicts around the world. And what I always say is that does it really matter to someone who's lost their leg or who's lost their loved one whether or not this war is more or less barbaric, or whether the violations were more or less severe than in some other place? It doesn't matter. It's not going to. What matters to them is the losses and the suffering that they're enduring, and what matters is what is Russia's record on adhering to the Geneva Conventions. I'm very glad that you brought that up. This is a war. It's quite clear now that that Russia's intent is to seize territory. I think it's made quite clear that they are, the territory that they've seized, they plan to annex. I think there've been even announcements about that. What the path to annexation yet is, that's not clear yet, and the timeline isn't clear. But the intent seems quite clear. I'm glad you brought up the Geneva Conventions, which are the laws of war. People seem surprised sometimes to hear that there's something called the laws of war. Yes, wars are supposed to be governed by certain rules in order to limit civilian suffering, and the warring parties here, Russia and Ukraine, are obligated to uphold them. They've both ratified the Geneva Convention, so Russia has these obligations. And what we have, we've been documenting the conduct in the war since the full-scale invasion started on February 24th, and we have documented a full range of pretty horrific war crimes and other violations of humanitarian law. So Ismail, whether or not Russia's conduct in Ukraine is worse, or whether it was than it was in Syria, or whether it was worse than it was in Chechnya, or whether it was predictable because of its record in Chechnya and Syria and elsewhere. Again, it's interesting to historians. It's interesting to analysts, but again, it's not going to make it a different. I guess it's not going to make a difference for people who have been. For the civilians who have lost their loved ones, who have lost their limbs, who have lost their homes. Do they really care that Russia did the same thing? And is it going to change anything for them that Russia obliterated Grozny during the 1999 war there? I don't know.
I understand suffering is suffering, but I'm trying to look at it from an institutional point of view and establish sort of a baseline maybe for the future. Look one step ahead and predict what the reaction of the West will be. Will there be a Nuremberg-style trial? Will international organizations such as Human Rights Watch and your other partners collect an enormous body of evidence that will necessitate the Russian Federation's government be tried, at least in absentia or with their presence in, let's say, The Hague or the theoretical Hague? Will that be possible? Do you think the body of evidence is there?
Well, first, I'd like to do two things. I'd like to talk about the kinds of violations that we've documented and how we've done it, if that's interesting, and then we'll attack we'll get at the justice question.
Please.
So the kinds of we've been on the ground basically with rotating teams in Ukraine since February 24th, and we've been documenting basically 3 or 4 different sets of violations of Geneva Conventions, and the first is the Geneva Conventions are supposed to they require warring parties to do everything possible to preserve civilian life and prevent harm to civilians, and that means they have to always discriminate between or discern between what's a civilian object and what's a legitimate military target, and they shouldn't be attacking areas in a way that doesn't discern between what the military target is and what the civilian objects are around them. And obviously they must not deliberately attack civilians. So, and what we've found are many instances when Russian forces have attacked using indiscriminate force, which means that they maybe if there's it means that they've attacked a civilian area, and many of these, let's remember that Russia has attacked numerous big, large, heavily densely populated cities in Ukraine, and built apartment buildings, hospitals, schools, shops, supermarkets, homes have all been in these cities, and in Kharkiv, and we've documented this in Kharkiv, in Chernihiv, in Mykolaiv, in Kiev, and elsewhere, have all been hit and in these cities, and with various degrees of devastation. And what we've documented is that in many instances there was no target, no legitimate military target in the immediate vicinity. Maybe there was a military target like a couple of kilometers away, which means that if that's what the Russian forces were after with their with the ground strikes, ground launch strikes, or with the air strikes, it means that they were either using wildly indiscriminate weapons, or and just regular artillery attacks are it's quite indiscriminate, or they intended to hit civilian objects. It's hard to tell. Or in some cases there would be like a legitimate military target in the close vicinity of civilian air, residential of a residence, but the weapon that they chose to take out that military target was so indiscriminate that it took out a whole building and caused massive civilian harm. So but some of the attacks, Ismail, that we documented, there was no military target that we could discern in the vicinity, and we did that work not only by obviously interviewing people who were there, who were witnesses. When we could, we went to these cities once the Russian forces withdrew, to collect, to examine the damage, to look at the blast, the blast holes, to look at the varonki. I forget how you say varonka in English. Yeah, the
The
Varonki.
I do too. The hole that that
Yeah,
is left
whatever.
by a bombardment, right?
Yeah,
We're
to
talking
look
about
at
the hole in the ground.
to look at shrapnel. We and we also use satellite imagery to try to detect what kinds of military targets might have been in the area, because sometimes, you know, civilians just don't know.
Mhm.
So we use all of those, and we also use verified images, whether they're video images or still images, to continue to build the picture of what happened in particular attacks. Russian forces have been using cluster munitions, кассетные боеприпасы, rather rather prodigiously in this war, and
Has Russia signed the part of the convention banning
no,
the use of those weapons? Okay.
no, Russia hasn't signed. Neither has Ukraine. The convention against the use of cluster munitions, but a warring party doesn't need to sign the convention in order to be obligated not to use these weapons in civilian areas, because a weapon like a cluster munition, which explodes in the air or upon impact and releases dozens and sometimes hundreds of other bomblets over a wide area. Sometimes an area as large as a football field. That in and of itself is highly indiscriminate. It's a dumb rocket, right? So it's gonna, when it explodes in the air and spreads all these other bomblets, it's not gonna, these bomblets aren't gonna be able to distinguish, what's a hospital and what's a legitimate military target, what's a civilian, what's a soldier. That's the very epitome of indiscriminate. So a lot of our work has been focused on that, and it's very time consuming. Often, the pace of the work that's required in order to make a solid conclusion about whether an attack was lawful or unlawful doesn't keep up with the time with the timeline that journalists often have when they, an attack happens, they want to know right away, was this a war crime? But I mean, but you're right, Ismail. You said that one of the biggest casualties of war is the facts, but it's not a forever casualty, because the facts eventually get determined with time, diligence, patience. The facts always come out. So that's one big bucket of types of violations we documented. The other big area of violations that we documented is Russian conduct in areas that were under its forces' control, or occupation. So we, like other organizations, I have to tip my hat here to the many Ukrainian human rights groups that have been actively documenting violations, and also Amnesty International, which has been actively documenting violations. After we have been closely scrutinizing how Russian forces behave themselves in Kiev, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv regions when parts of these regions were under Russian control. And so we documented how Russian forces committed summary executions, detained people in absolutely horrific, sordid conditions, sometimes in pits or in boiler rooms and school basements with hundreds of people, or how they went, house to house, pulling people, detaining people who they suspected of being part of the Ukrainian military, or giving information to the Ukrainian military or Ukrainian security services, or just in any way being pro-Ukrainian. So they would, or they were also searching for arms. So they would go house to house. It's pretty classic, house to house, look for these people, You pull them out, you search their phones, they took them to these detention places, these like informal, horrific detention places, held them for long periods of time without food, without letting them, and often, for long periods without the proper toilet. In some cases, tortured them with electric shocks or with beatings, and in some cases, just summarily executing them. We talked to one woman in Bucha who saw herself, who described in very cold and accurate detail how during one search she was brought out to an area, public area in Bucha, along with dozens of other civilians, and she saw Russian forces bring in 5 guys, pull their t-shirts over their heads, force them to take their boots off, put them on their knees, and popped one of them in the back of the head. Imagine seeing that. Imagine witnessing that.
Rachel, these are horrific examples you're describing, and the media are full of those. The last few months, we've been seeing quite a lot of them. And I'm especially grateful to people like yourselves and your local partners in Ukraine who document all this. As you said, patience will prevail, and sooner or later, the truth will become, will no longer be the victim. But the problem is, if we look at the Russian media, the Russian propaganda machine, essentially, there is this favorite hit parade of what they repeat and repeat ad nauseum. First of all, when it comes to indiscriminate shelling and bombing using cluster munitions, etc., etc., they always point their finger to the West. It doesn't fail, does it, really? I mean, they talk about the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade decades ago. They talk about Bucha being completely staged. How is it? Essentially, we're trying to get the truth to the people of the Russian Federation who are not ready to see the war for what it is. How do you think the West and the world in general, not only the West, Ukraine, how do you think we're all faring in trying to get the message across to the Russian people? Does that aspect of the issue concern anybody that you know of?
Of course, it's an issue of concern, and it's especially an issue of concern because, the Russian state media has been churning out so much just toxic bullshit. Sorry, so much toxic, malicious, vicious. Incitement in some cases, statements and lies, and they put so many resources behind it. It can be quite deafening. I think it's pointless to try to compete with it. We put our facts out. We try to put them out as neutrally as possible. I don't think anybody else. I think that it's really important to try to reach the minds of people whose minds maybe aren't made up or haven't been. People who haven't decided quite yet. Eventually, Ismail, the truth does get told. Eventually, the truth does come out, and we have to continue to translate make sure that our materials are available in Russian and on platforms that people in Russia can view. Of course, the government has done everything it can to make that impossible by blocking our website, which as you probably heard, they've done. Well, they closed our office in Russia, which we'd had for 30 years. They closed it back in April, about as surprising as the sun coming up. But that doesn't stop us from doing our documentation and from publishing our findings and from really trying to reach a Russian audience. But Ismail, the most important thing right now for us is justice, and doing this documentation for with a goal to seeing justice done, no matter how hard that might be and no matter how long it might take. Look, Human Rights Watch can't take people to court. We're not a litigating organization. Fortunately, there is an unprecedented commitment to justice for war crimes in this war. I can't think of any other precedent when the International Criminal Court opened an investigation literally like a week after a war started. So you have the International Criminal Court, which is which has an investigation open. We have numerous countries that have what's called universal jurisdiction laws, which means that they can try in their courts grave crimes that took place outside of the country's borders. So numerous countries have these laws and are committed to taking on cases that took place in Ukraine. There's a huge investment both by the European Union and by individual European Union countries in the European Union and by the United States, a huge investment in making sure in building the capacity of the Ukrainian judiciary and investigative agencies to delivering impartial justice for war crimes. There are
Yeah, I was going to say this issue of conflicting and now warring narratives between the West and Russia. I asked this question with one eye on the future, with one eye on the possible deliverance of justice, so to speak, delivery of justice, so to speak. My concern is, and I will read a comment from one of the viewers that speaks to some of my concerns. That's the point. Syria showed that no one can do whatever they want, no repercussion, no real concern. You're speaking of unprecedented interest on behalf of the International Criminal Court, ICC, and unprecedented international reaction to this war. Do you think that if smaller violations in the past garnered so much international attention from the very same ICC and international bodies, Russia, it would have come to this point now. It would have come to Russia openly invading a neighboring country. Do you think that the previous passes that Russia has received with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and other acts, war in Georgia comes to mind in 2008. Do you think if the West's reaction were a little more terse, Russia would have done the same thing? I know that we're speculating right now, but it sort of forms a picture of the world that we're living in now, doesn't it?
Well, Ismail, you said it. That's speculating, and I really can't speculate. I would like to say to the viewer who said that's the point about with Syria, just to point out that there was a fairly high-level Syrian official who was brought to justice in Koblenz in Germany a couple of months ago. Someone who was responsible for who I think oversaw one of the horrific prisons in Syria where like hundreds and hundreds of people had been tortured and died. He was living abroad, living in Germany, and was eventually arrested and tried, and I believe sentenced to life in prison. I'd have to double check that though. I don't remember what his sentence was, but I mean, it's one person, but it's a beginning. And I think that I'm optimistic. I have to be optimistic that there will be repercussions for the calamity of suffering and destruction against civilians that in violation of the Geneva Conventions that Russia has perpetrated. They can't run away from it. I can't. Ismail, I just said that I can't speculate on the future, and I can't speculate on the past. I can't speculate. Had the West done X, Y, or Z, then we would have had a different outcome. I don't know.
Okay, let me put it this way: would you have wanted?
But what I do know is that we don't know the future. We don't. We can't. I mean, anyone who says, "Well, this is how Putin's going to leave office in the Kremlin," they're maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. We don't know. No one has a crystal ball, so no one knows how. Knows how this is all going to end. So that means that there is an opportunity. The officials who can be held to account for the widespread atrocity crimes that have taken place in Ukraine. And there's one that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the crime of forced transfers of Ukrainian citizens to Russia. When Ukrainian citizens fled mostly from Mariupol and were basically given no other choice than to go to Russia and to be put through this filtration process where they were questioned and their data was sucked out of their phones, and they were fingerprinted, and they're treated like criminals. Fingerprinted, photographed, every single one of them, that went through this process. And there were, it's hard to say exactly how many there were, thousands, maybe, who knows, put through this filtration process, and so the Russian, mostly, they were almost all in DNR, the filtration points were, but, this data is now sitting in some security forces, in the security force, the databases of Russian security agencies on how many Ukrainian citizens, right? Mm-hmm. And but the notion then of like giving people basically not giving people a choice, because either because they say, and we interviewed people who told us that either that Russia or Russia-linked forces said, you're getting on this, you get on this bus, get out of your shelter, get on this bus, and then the bus takes you to a filtration point, and then onward to the Russian Federation. And you can escape that if you happen to have enough money to hire a taxi. But if you don't, well, then you're kind of stuck, and you go to Russia. No one forces you to stay in Russia, but in many cases, at least in the people we interviewed, and what they're sort of brought there under false. They're not given the full facts of the situation. They're told that they have to apply for refugee status, or they're told that they have to give up their Ukrainian citizenship, or they're sort of pressured to give testimony about Ukrainian war crimes, and here they are in Russian territory. No, that's true that no one is forcing them to stay, but can you imagine the pressure these people are under?
So these forced relocations, can we call them kidnapping, state-sponsored kidnapping? Is that pretty much the same thing?
There's a specific legal term for it, and the legal term is forced transfer. So when you have somebody who is brought by one warring party, when a warring party takes somebody from the other side of the conflict, and brings them against, with any kind of coercion, from their home state to either territory occupied by that warring party. In this case, it would be DNR or LNR, or the warring party state. In this case, the Russian Federation. That's a forced transfer. And what coercion means, it doesn't mean that you necessarily put a gun to someone's head and say, "You come with me or else." Although we did document a couple of instances when Russian forces or Russian-linked forces basically didn't give people a choice. They just said, you have to do this or else. But it doesn't require that kind of force in order for it to count as coercion. It could just be that people felt that if they stayed in Mariupol, they would get, they would die from the shelling. But there or it could be that that they were fearful that if they didn't go with if they stayed, that they would be harmed by the occupation forces or whatever. But the thing is that there were multiple opportunities when there should have been opportunities for people to be able to leave DNR, LNR, or actually this is just DNR, or multiple opportunities when there should have been more efforts to let people leave by evacuation buses to go to Ukrainian-held territory. They shouldn't have been forced to undergo this completely unlawful filtration process.
All right. They say we don't have a crystal ball, but hindsight is 2020. They say. I'm sorry for mixing metaphors. I wanted to address the concerns coming from some of the viewers about the language in which we speak today. Many are asking whether you and I could speak in Russian. Maybe one of these days we'll do an interview in Russian if you're available. I just wanted to let our audience know that the choice of language is always with our guests, not with our channel. And we decided that it would be more convenient and more comfortable to discuss such emotional issues, actually, in a language in which Rachel and I prefer and are accustomed to discuss them. If I may go back to materials in Russian being banned by the Russian government and your office being closed down. You know, Rachel, I have a suspicion that despite multitude of information available to the Russian citizens prior to the war in their own native language, it was just a click away. Deutsche Welle, BBC Russian, your organization's website, and many other websites. It seems to me that the Russian people have gone into this cognitive dissonance where they want to stay in their own silo and echo chamber, as we call it in English, and only hear the opinions that reinforce their own. Do you think, if we look at the situation in the past, hindsight, employ our hindsight, which is 2020, they say, do you think something should have been done differently in terms of not targeting the Russian people, but making information more available or more interesting to them or more appealing to them? How is it possible that the West, with all these reputable media sources, which broadcast in Russian language as well as many other languages, somehow could not convince or inform the Russian people of the most basic facts, that they labor under so much misunderstanding of the situation around the world, where they see one picture and actually something completely different is unfolding? If you agree with my assessment, do you think there was something that could have been done differently in the past?
Sure. I mean, we could all have done our work differently and in a better way in the past. We should all have worked harder to show the not just the appeal of human rights, but how it affects people in their everyday lives. This is not a new discussion. Я очень извиняюсь за то, что я говорю по-английски. Тут я читаю отзыв от вашего зрителя. Я очень прошу ваше понимание, что я просто это дело не только в том, что я более комфортно себя чувствую на английском. Я думаю, действительно, что было бы очень сложно меня слушать на русском, потому что я допускаю так много ошибок.
Рэйчел, твой русский лучше, чем мой. Давай.
No. So I think that this isn't a new discussion. I mean, I can remember back in even the mid 1990s, people were calling democracy. Because what they saw from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the onset of the democratic period, all they saw was chaos, the disappearance of their pensions, massive corruption, and it's not new. But if you talk to people about things that mattered to them that in fact were rights issues, like if you broke it down into, well, let's talk about treatment by the police. I don't think anyone. I think you had much greater understanding about the need for human rights and human rights protection from state agencies that were abusive. Or if you talk to mothers whose sons went through the process of dedovshchina, and mothers who really feared for their sons of going in the Russian army particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, when dedovshchina was really bad, and when the Russian military wasn't due to corruption or poverty or other factors, just wasn't really providing for conscripts. Well, those are human rights issues, and people cared about them. But government has been very successful, or was very successful. And I think it's also our fault as well, not branding ourselves properly, or not spending enough time on the human rights issues that affect people's social and economic rights, because because then the government was able to hijack the label.
The reason why I'm so focused on Russia, and this sort of criticism is directed at myself and my colleagues, as well as human rights community and all other, many other groups of people, because it feels like it was our fault and something we had not done correctly to lose the war for the hearts and minds of the Russian people, so to speak. The reason I'm so focused on this is we will have to deal with Russia no matter what the outcome of the war in Ukraine will be. Whether Russia will have a more West-oriented, facade, whether Russia will adhere to the international norms and principles and human rights as we have come to know them, or whether Russia will be a much more hostile power, we will still have to operate, we will still have to have some sort of a dialogue with the Russian people. That is a question that goes to the heart of the justice. If there is no support by the Russian people, I doubt that those people responsible for this war will be brought before any court, be it within Russia itself or abroad. That is why I'm kind of trying to look through time and see the future. When you look at the future in Russia, I know we're not speculating, but what do you think we will see when the war is over? What do you think? Will it be more difficult for you to do your job with, in that region, in Russia, Europe, Central Asia, or will there be more challenges that we cannot even predict right now?
Well, first of all, you say when the war is over. When is that going to be?
Mm-hmm.
And on what terms?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty complicated, Ismail, because we don't know how this is going to end. It's hard to see even at this point when it's going to end. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that.
But are we prepared to deal with that part of the world whenever the war is over? Do you think the same tools, the same mechanisms, the same decision-making processes, do you think there will be enough, or do you think that we will all have to sit down and sort of reevaluate how things had been done in the past in order to chart a path to the future? That's what I'm trying to think.
I think we should always be reevaluating the things that we do and the way that we do them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we should always be working on human rights issues in any country, and in Russia, obviously, is going to always be a mix of the issues that are relating to the most marginalized and oppressed communities, which by definition, means not the majority communities. It's always going to be a mix of that, and also issues that affect everybody or affect large numbers of people. So so for example, in Russia, how can we not work on the rights of LGBT people, when the government is on a, I don't like to use the word warpath, because it's in an actual war right now where it's slaughtering people, but where the government is really on a warpath against the rights of many large numbers of people in the LGBTQ community. It's marginalizing them. It's discriminating against them, and it's also mobilizing, horrible, hateful, toxic rhetoric against them, because it's using the LGBTQ issue to also, taint the West and show that the West is the enemy, and I mean, all of that.
Unfortunately,
so how can we not work on that? How can we leave that aside? Or Jehovah's Witnesses, who don't, it's a religious community. You can disagree with their religion. You can disagree with the religious precepts. You can be irritated by them when they knock on your door. But, should they be in jail? is it right that there are hundreds that have been through the prison system already, and and dozens who are in jail right now for nothing more than being, for practicing the Jehovah's Witness faith? Should that be a something that puts you behind bars? And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who are Jehovah's Witnesses in some are currently in some path of the criminal justice system, either because they're under suspicion, they're somewhere in the criminal justice system as an accused or as a defendant, and that's perverse, and that's been since 2017. And these aren't these are people who are reviled by, at worst, obviously reviled by the Russian public, or many Russians just don't care about them. But how can we just stand by and let that happen, even though and not stand up for their rights, no matter that that's not going to be a popular issue in Russia, and it never will be. So we need to do that on the one hand. I mean, to really fight for the rights of people who are truly marginalized. And at the same time, there are issues that affect every single or large numbers of Russian households. Domestic violence, hits large numbers of households throughout the country. Or the fate of older people who want to live independently, but whose ability to live independently is jeopardized because they can't afford they can't afford they can't afford to live independently. They need services, and they're not getting enough services, and the only choice is either to to skip meals, or to live in very terrible conditions, or to go into an internat, or a dom prestarial, right? So that hits large numbers, and this is also a rights. These are rights issues, or people who this was an issue, more in the 1990s. I wish that we had covered it. I wish that we had documented it as a human rights violation when people didn't get their pensions.
Somehow calling it internat and dom prestarilich is more correct than using the English equivalents, because the English versions don't quite describe the experience or the nature of those
nursing home, you mean? Care homes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No. What I'm trying to say is they don't quite describe what we're trying to describe in Russian. Rachel, in my view, the Russian propaganda, and not only the Russian propaganda, but propaganda of those countries that are under Russia's influence, which I believe, sadly, my native Azerbaijan is one of those examples, have been very successful at creating an imaginary link between human rights and respect for human rights on the one hand, and color revolutions or intentional destabilizations of the political situations in those countries. Because somehow when you bring up LGBT rights, when you bring up the rights of the elderly, when you bring up anybody's rights, somehow it is viewed as a program, as you being part of the fifth column that is trying to destabilize. Here's a case in point. Thinking it is not time to say about LGBT when it's war in Ukraine. So basically, our viewer is trying to say in a language that is not very native to him or her that the war in Ukraine is not the time to speak about the rights of LGBT or anybody else's rights. Why do you agree with that? Do you think that during the war in Ukraine we all have to be laser focused on the war and we cannot talk about the rights of other communities?
Well, I think we always have to do both. I mean, we are laser focused on the war in Ukraine. I mean, that's what we've been doing extensively with rotating teams that have been in Ukraine, basically, like I said, for the past 4 months. But we still have to talk about the rights of people who live in Russia and who are who are the targets of discrimination and persecution. One doesn't cancel out the other.
Mm-hmm. There were unprecedented protests against the war in Ukraine by the Russian citizens. We've seen mass arrests in the public squares in Moscow and St. Petersburg and other major cities. Do you think the Russian government does get the message that not everybody in the Russian Federation is supporting its course? Do you think, and is there some sort of a back channel between, or any channel of communication, not back, maybe a front, between human rights organizations and the Russian government? Is the Russian government willing to listen to you right now?
Well,
I'm glad I injected levity in our conversation because it was much needed. Is it even funny to talk about this?
no, it's not funny at all. Ideally, we would, Human Rights Watch would have a dialogue with every government in countries where we do our work, and we don't have a dialogue with the Russian government now, and we have sent. We send letters and letters of inquiry, ask questions, and we don't get replies. That's not a funny question. It's not funny at all. You've asked so many questions now, Ismail, and they were all rolled into one. So now I'm forgetting them one by one.
I was talking about the protests in Russia itself. Do you think the Russian government is getting the message?
Yes, there have been protests, and people have been, as you know, and as your viewers know, have been prosecuted and on criminal and also administrative charges. And so there are people who are in jail now for actions that the government is saying are spreading false information about the Russian military. And then there are also many others who have been fined for discrediting the Russian military, for doing nothing more than holding a poster with a bunch of звездочки on it, to say "Нет войне." So does that mean that the Russian government is getting back-channeled information? I don't think it doesn't seem that the Russian government right now is interested in that at all.
Rachel, my concern is, being from Azerbaijan, is that while we are focused on Ukraine, it sort of saps our capacity to pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world. And I've noticed this trend. You may disagree with me, but it was my personal observation that there's a tendency by the West and Western organizations and governments to sort of choose cause célèbre one country and sort of focus on it. Georgia comes to mind, and sort of not neglect, but not to pay enough attention to what's going on around. For instance, I believe Azerbaijan was neglected. I believe the movement in Azerbaijan for freedom, for democracy, has been sort of overlooked because all of the attention was focused on Georgia. And I don't want this to play itself out in Ukraine again. Do you think that rulers of countries like Azerbaijan or other nations in that region, because you're responsible for Central Asia as well, do you think they feel this sort of invincibility right now because they know that the West is concerned with Ukraine and there's not much capacity or bandwidth, so to speak, to pay attention to what's going on around Ukraine?
I don't know, Ismail. I don't know if that's really what motivates governments to do bad things. Maybe it's a factor, but I tend to think that that governments have their own timetables and their own internal exigencies that make them, try to, for example, adopt bad laws or adopt repressive laws or arrest their opponents or go back, engage in regression. I did think, like, back in 2014, 2015, when Azerbaijan was undergoing this really intense period of repression, when all the journalists and the human rights activists were arrested and went on trial, and everyone was asking, why is this happening now? I thought that to a certain extent that maybe it was because the government felt that the West was distracted, but I don't know if maybe it was distracted by Ukraine because it sort of coincided with the period of when of the annexation of the occupation, the war in Donbass, Maidan, and the occupation of Crimea. Maybe there was a calculation that the West isn't going to care.
And that was a wrong calculation, you're saying. The West
it was a wrong calculation because there was a huge outpouring.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know whether that was to what degree that was a big factor. I think that there was probably. I mean, you're from Azerbaijan. You'll tell me what was the big motivating factor behind that massive crackdown at that moment. I mean, the other thing is that there was a lead up to that went months and months before Maidan even happened. I think they were freaked out by Maidan, more freaked out by Maidan than anything else. And they were more freaked out by Maidan than they were taking advantage of the West being distracted by Crimea.
Mm. And that goes again to the Russian propaganda, producing this narrative that the fight for most basic rights and freedoms somehow is a precursor to overthrowing governments. Rachel, I would be
wait, Ismail, wait, you're not going to get away with that easily.
No, no. Yeah, I'm not trying to get away with anything. Please,
okay,
go ahead.
I just wanted to say two things. One is that it takes a pretty repressive government with a pretty repressive view to equate the fight for, or to equate the need or the imperative for rights with, or conflate it with violent overthrow of a government. And it's a favorite rhetoric. It's favorite rhetoric by authoritarian governments that believe that their people have no agency. That if they're out on the streets, it's because the Gusjep is paying them. I mean, these people. I mean, governments are are wrong to think that people don't have agency, and people aren't motivated by their own sense of despair, or their own sense of hope. And I think it takes for the drive for rights to lead to people going out to the streets to not every protest is far from it. Not every protest is a protest that's leading to the overthrow of government. And if that's the conflation, then there's a very serious problem with the relationship between the state and the citizen, because it means that it has completely alienated its public.
And in my view, that is exactly the line that is being pushed by the Russian propaganda, and propaganda machines in Azerbaijan and other countries in that region, unfortunately, are only too glad to pick it up and spread it even more in their own native languages. And that is a problem that I'm seeing, and I'm glad we agree on this. Rachel, today is a very important day for the United States. Roe versus Wade was overturned, and I would be amiss if I didn't ask this question at the end. As an American woman, as a U.S. citizen, as somebody who works for human rights abroad, is it of concern at all? And it pains me to ask this question and put it this way. Is it concern at all that a woman in a country where we don't normally expect much respect for human rights can walk into a clinic and get a procedure as she decides? She has more agency than it turns out the American women might in the future. Forgive me. I rarely quote President Obama, but I would like to. The Supreme Court relegated the most intensely personal decision someone can make to the whims of politicians and ideologues, attacking the essential freedoms of millions of Americans. Is it at all concerning that, do you think it's a step back, and is it at all concerning that we have to revisit this war? We have to make a case for a woman making the most intimate decision on her own, or maybe involving whomever she decides to involve, but not the state institutions, and not the law. Is it at all a concern for you personally? And if you could also provide the Human Rights Watch as an organization, its view on this.
Well, I mean, I can only really say what's most important isn't what I think personally as a woman or as an American woman. I it is an absolutely abortion is it's a right it's a to it's a right that's critical to guaranteeing a wide range of other human rights. So when the court doesn't uphold the right to something that's going to be a gateway for women's or that's going to really undermine women's security of person, their privacy. It brings on issues of non-discrimination or freedom from even freedom from cruel and inhuman treatment. Of course, this is a 5 alarm fire. It's an emergency. It is quite. You asked if it's a setback. It's hard to express just what kind of dramatic setback this is, because it leads to an infringement on all of those rights, and also it's going to be a big setback, particularly for women living in poverty. It's going to be a big setback for women, uh, for Black women, for in particular for yeah, it's a huge setback, and it's also the United States is already has the highest maternal mortality rate of among the 10 wealthiest countries. So we need to brace for even higher maternal mortality and morbidity to rise, especially especially in communities among Black people and people living in poverty. This just and also it just kind of cements the United States as an outlier in terms of abortion rights, rights to abortion care around the world. Thailand, Ireland, Mexico, all of these countries have been expanding abortion rights and not restricting them, but here is the United States restricting them.
You mean rising mortality and morbidity related to overt abortions? I mean, covert abortions, abortions not performed in clinics. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So I hate to say this, but from what I've seen in the movies from the 1960s and 70s, I guess a symbol of that was, please forgive me, a coat hanger. So we're basically talking about the wealthiest nation in the world with the best clinics in the world, arguably, where people do not have access to a medical procedure and have to sort of.
Well, in great numbers of states, there will still be states where abortion will still be available, but just look what's happening in Texas.
We have 21 states and 4 states planning to ban abortion as soon as they were waiting for this Supreme Court decision. So roughly half of the U.S. states, and Texas is a large state where traveling to another country, to another state will require significant resources. Is that what we're talking about? The difficulty of traveling on taxing?
And who can afford that? So.
Rachel, unfortunately, every time you and I talk, or every time I talk to human rights organizations, it's quite, the picture of the world we get is quite sad. I truly hope there will be one day when we could get together and hopefully speak in Russian, as our audience now demands. Hopefully we can get together and speak about something in more optimistic terms. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I'm going to ask you for your time in the future. You can count on that. And I really do appreciate your time today coming on the program and discussing, the situation in Ukraine and Europe in general. I know it's a very busy season for all of us, right?
Thank you, Ismail. Thank you for taking the time. It makes me sad that our discussions leave you feeling that we're covering grim territory. We are covering grim territory, but we do this because we are optimists. I wouldn't do this. I couldn't do this work for as long as I have without being an optimist, without knowing that we're going to make a change in people's lives for the better. That it's possible.
I truly hope it is the case, and your optimism is contagious, I should say. Rachel, thank you again very much, and I
Thank you.
hope to talk to you in the future, very soon, hopefully.
Спасибо.
Спасибо огромное. Thank
До
you. До свидания. Bye. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for watching us. I appreciate our guests' time and your time putting into this. I will address our audience in Russian because there were quite a few comments in the chat. Выбор языка мы всегда оставляем за нашими гостями. Мы с удовольствием поговорим с нашими гостями на любом языке, на котором они хотят говорить, если мы тоже им владеем, да, то есть будь то азербайджанский, русский, английский и даже турецкий. Вопрос вот в чем. Сложные темы очень сложно обсуждать на языке, который не является родным для человека. То есть я был в этой ситуации, я пытался обсуждать международную политику на турецком языке. Что из этого вышло? Это все гуляет в интернете. Можете посмотреть, послушать и посмеяться. Хотя турецкий для себя я тоже считаю родным. Вопрос вот в чем. Когда я вижу от нашей аудитории вот такие вот комментарии, там, кто-то алфавит пересчитывает, то есть я это считаю ничем иным, как троллингом, да, понимаете, мы эту работу выполняем для вас, мы эту работу выполняем для того, чтобы азербайджанская аудитория побольше узнала о мире, и мир узнал побольше об азербайджанской аудитории. Вот такое вот странное поведение некоторых наших зрителей, да, если вы не понимаете язык, вы можете это интервью пропустить. Вы можете посмотреть что-то другое, благо на нашем канале огромное количество очень довольно-таки интересных интервью, на мой взгляд. Есть из чего выбирать, грубо говоря. На этой неделе мы только сделали 2 интервью, и вот это 3. Да, но оставаться и говорить, и заставлять человека общаться на языке, на котором он не считает, или она не считает возможным общаться на данный момент, да, это очень некрасиво, я считаю, и то, что мир узнает о нашей аудитории, это не очень хорошо. Мы хотели, чтобы нашу аудиторию знали по-другому. Но, к сожалению, очень часто приходится возвращаться вот к такой вот воспитательной работе. Время от времени, господа и дамы, пожалуйста, думайте о том, как вы выглядите со стороны. Особенно, когда вы печатаете, комментируете под интервью с человеком определенного уровня, чье интервью будут потом смотреть, и не только в Азербайджане, да. Этот канал работает не только для Азербайджана, не только на азербайджанскую аудиторию, то есть он работает для Азербайджана, но не только географического Азербайджана. Азербайджанцы живут по всему миру, и те, кто говорят по-английски, тоже живут по всему миру. То есть вот, опять-таки, не заставляйте меня жалеть, что я скрещиваю две аудитории, азербайджанскую и любую другую, потому что испытывать чувство стыда за свой народ мне очень неприятно. Очень неприятно. Я живу в Америке довольно-таки давно, и это чувство мне приходилось в прошлом испытывать довольно-таки часто, работая с азербайджанцами тут. Я не хочу к этому чувству стыда возвращаться еще раз из-за поведения некоторых наших зрителей. Да? Пожалуйста, поймите то, что я говорю правильно, как конструктивную критику, а не как нападение и оскорбление. Если вы к этому подойдете правильно, вы поймете, о чем я говорю. Нас смотрят и ваши соседи тоже. Ваши, потому что я там не живу. И я знаю, что вас очень волнует, что о вас думают в Армении. То есть подумайте о том, как вы выглядите в глазах наших соседей в том числе. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This is it from us for this week. And next week, we're hoping to see you again. I cannot promise that we'll have interviews in English, but we will in Russian and Azerbaijani. And those who are not our viewers, constant viewers, to those of you to whom Russian is accessible or Azerbaijani is accessible, please do subscribe. Thank you and have a good day. Bye.